All right, in this video we continue Unit 2, or Unit 4, sorry, talking about the muscular system. This is 4.2, muscle anatomy. So we're basically going to be going through looking at some of the parts of the muscles, which kind of sets us up for the next lecture where we'll be looking at how muscles work. All right, so we're getting pretty deep into the anatomy of a muscle here. And so this is more of a micro anatomy because this is anatomy on a cellular level. So this is individual muscle cells here. And so muscle cells, these muscle cells here, you see these pictures here. This is like an actual microscope picture. Muscle cells are multinucleated, meaning they have more than one nucleus because they're so long. They're really long cylindrical cells. They are covered by a membrane called the sarcolemma. Sarco means flesh. And so I don't know if that helps you, but it's just this membrane. It's like it's just a cell membrane for the muscle cell. And the sarcoplasm is actually the cytoplasm on the inside. Don't see that labeled here. And inside the muscle cell, there are lots of organelles that are specifically there to store glycogen, which is a way that muscle cells, or all cells, store glucose. And there's other molecules called myoglobin, and myoglobin is there for oxygen storage because muscles use lots of glucose and lots of oxygen. And there are some other modified organelles that you need to be familiar with. There are these myofibrils, which are basically cytoskeletal elements, and they are composed of different parts, which we will talk more about in a moment. And then there's a specialized endoplasmic reticulum called the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which we'll talk specifically about. And then there are these structures called TTubules, which you don't see on this picture either, but we will talk about those TTubules. And so let's look more in the weeds on the myofibrils. Let me go back here to talk about myofibrils first. These are densely packed, rod-like elements inside of a muscle cell. So if I took a group of pencils and held them, that would, in each individual pencil would be a myofibril, very densely packed in here. A single muscle fiber can contain thousands of these, and they account for approximately 80% of the inside of a muscle cell. This is where you see these striations, these stripes inside the muscle cell too. This is where they get the striation from. It's these different bands, and we'll talk, all this is H zone and Z disc and I band and A band. We're not going to worry about any of that. That's a little bit too much information for us. But these striations are basically formed by these repeated light bands and dark bands, and it just has to do with the density of the microfibers that are in there. You see here, this will be a dark band because these fibers are overlapping one another, and this light band is because there's not any overlapping. The sarcomere is known as the functional unit of the muscle cell, and this whole thing here is called a sarcomere, and it is made up of primarily of two myofilaments. Let me go here. This is a zoom in on this sarcomere. It's made up of two filaments, myosin, which is known as the thick filament, and actin, which is known as the thin filament. And you can see here the actin overlap these myosin that are these thick filaments, and they have these little heads on them. We call these the myosin heads. And the way muscle contraction works is basically the myosin heads are pulling these actins toward the middle. And so you can imagine if both of these sets are getting closer to one another, then that whole muscle is going to contract. And so when we talk about the sarcomere, this is what we're talking about, these individual structures. But if you go up here, you can see here that the sarcomeres, in the grand scheme of things, are really small, and there's literally hundreds of thousands of them inside of an individual muscle cell. But if every one of them gets smaller, the whole muscle will contract. So next, we'll look at this idea of the sarcoplasmic reticulum. It's a modified endoplasmic reticulum. It's smooth ER, and it is surrounding each one of these myofibrils. You can see that here. This blue business is the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And the function of the sarcoplasmic reticulum is to regulate the amount of calcium that is found inside the muscle cell. Calcium is vital to the muscle contraction. Without it, it just doesn't contract. And so the purpose of this sarcoplasmic reticulum is to store and release calcium when it is needed by the muscle cell. And then the last part here is called the TTubule. It's probably stands for something, but I always just thought it looked like a T because of the line here and the straight, but you do what you want on that. The T-tubule is basically this is the sarcolemma, the cell membrane for the muscle cell. And there's basically a hole that goes down into the muscle cell with each of those myofibrils. And this increases the surface area, of course, of that muscle cell greatly. And the purpose of the T-tubule is it is actually going to transmit the action potential from the nerve down into the muscle cell and cause these myofibrils to contract. And so it serves as kind of like a conduit for that electrical impulse that travels into the inside of the muscle cell.